The late evening sun filtered through the slats of the kitchen blinds, casting a golden glow over the countertops. I stood there, mindlessly drying a plate, listening to the soft hum of the dishwasher as it completed its cycle. My husband, James, sat in the living room, immersed in yet another episode of a financial podcast. His voice broke through occasionally, commenting on markets and investments to no one in particular. It had been weeks, months even, since we'd had a meaningful conversation. That was the nature of our marriage now. James was busy, always busy, and I was just here, a placeholder in a house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks, hoping to fill the silence in my own head, but it was impossible to ignore the hollowness that had seeped into every corner of our lives, and the sound of footsteps brought me out of my thoughts. Ethan, my stepbrother, entered the kitchen. He had this way of moving, calm, deliberate, yet effortlessly confident. His shaggy brown hair curled slightly at the edges, a remnant of his college days when he was too carefree to bother with proper grooming. He was back home now, after years of trying to find himself, as he put it. A breakup with his longtime girlfriend had sent him spiraling, and he'd crashed here until he could figure things out. "Hey, Sophie," he said, his voice smooth and slightly teasing. "You're drying that plate like it owes you money." I glanced down and realized I'd been wiping the same spot over and over. Laughing awkwardly, I set the plate down. "Just trying to keep busy, I guess." Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Busy doing what? Perfecting your dish-drying technique?" I smirked. His humor was the only thing that brought levity into the house these days. Something like that. He opened the fridge, rummaging through its contents before pulling out a soda. "You should take a break. Come sit with me on the porch." I hesitated, glancing toward the living room, where James remained glued to his podcast. "I don't know." Ethan popped the tab on his drink, the hiss of carbonation filling the space between us. "Come on, it's a nice evening. You deserve to enjoy it." Maybe it was the way he said it, light-hearted yet sincere, that convinced me. I grabbed a glass of water and followed him outside. The porch overlooked our small backyard where the summer sun had left streaks of orange and pink in the sky. Ethan sank into one of the old wicker chairs, patting the seat beside him. I joined him, exhaling as I allowed myself to relax for the first time all day. For a few moments we sat in silence, listening to the distant chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, given the thoughts swirling in my head. Ethan was the first to break the silence. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. I glanced at him, startled. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You just seem off, like something's bothering you." I opened my mouth to deflect, but the concern in his eyes stopped me. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me that way, like they genuinely cared. I sighed, turning my glass in my hands. "I don't know, Ethan. I guess I've just been feeling stuck." "Stuck how?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's hard to explain. James and I, we're not in a great place. He's always working, always distracted. Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible." Ethan frowned, his expression darkening. "He doesn't see how amazing you are? That's his loss." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks heat. "It's not that simple. Marriage is complicated." "Complicated doesn't mean you should feel alone," he said, his tone firm. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I looked away, sipping my water to hide the emotions threatening to surface. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing mine. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a spark up my arm, one that I quickly tried to suppress. "I'm sorry," he said, pulling his hand back. "I didn't mean to overstep." "No, it's okay," I said quickly, though my heart was racing. I don't really talk about this stuff with anyone." "Well, you can talk to me," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here for you, Sophie. Always." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. The sincerity in his words, the way he looked at me, it was too much. I felt exposed, like he could see the cracks I'd been trying so hard to hide. We sat there for a while longer, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, his plans for the future, funny stories from his college days, but even as we laughed, the weight of that earlier moment lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside James, who had fallen asleep within minutes, I found myself replaying the conversation with Ethan. His words, his touch, the way he'd looked at me, it was all etched into my mind. I turned onto my side, staring at the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. 11:47 p.m. Unable to sleep, I got up and padded quietly down the hall. The house was dark and silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. As I passed Ethan's door, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to keep walking, to go back to bed and pretend everything was normal, but another part, a louder, bolder part, urged me to knock. Before I could stop myself, I raised my hand and tapped lightly on the door. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened and Ethan stood there, his hair tousled and his eyes heavy with sleep. He blinked at me, clearly surprised. "Sophie," he said, his voice low. "What's wrong?" I couldn't sleep," I said, my words coming out in a rush. "I just needed to talk." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. The room was small and sparsely furnished, but it felt warm, intimate. I sat on the edge of his bed, hugging my knees to my chest as he settled into the chair by the desk. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. I hesitated, unsure of where to start. "I don't know. Everything, I guess. My life, my marriage. I feel like I'm drowning, Ethan." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You don't have to do this alone, Sophie. Whatever you need, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes. I looked at him, my defenses crumbling. I don't even know what I need. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. It was warm, solid, grounding. He didn't pull away. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly. "Don't forget that." His words settled over me like a balm, soothing the ache I hadn't realized I was carrying. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I felt seen, understood, and for the first time in a long time, not so alone. The next morning came with a heavy sense of guilt, but also an undeniable sense of clarity. I stood in the kitchen, absently stirring a cup of coffee while James packed his briefcase at the dining table. His usual routine, brief, efficient, and devoid of real conversation, felt like a stark contrast to the warmth and depth I'd felt in Ethan's room last night. "Don't forget we have the Johnsons' dinner this Saturday," James said without looking up. His tone was clipped, like he was ticking off an item on his mental checklist. I nodded, offering a half-hearted "sure," though my mind was elsewhere. The memory of Ethan's voice, his reassuring words, replayed in my head like a soothing melody. James stood, slinging his briefcase over his shoulder. He leaned in to kiss my cheek, a mechanical gesture that barely brushed my skin. "See you tonight," he said, already halfway out the door. "Have a good day," I replied, though I wasn't sure he even heard me. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, leaving behind a stillness I was beginning to dread. Ethan appeared a few moments later, his hair damp from a shower and a casual smile on his face. He moved through the room with an ease that was almost infectious, making it hard to stay locked in my own thoughts. "Morning," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He glanced at me, his smile fading slightly. "You okay?" I nodded quickly, trying to push the weight of my emotions aside. Yeah, just tired. He studied me for a moment, then gestured toward the backyard. Come on, let's get some air. I followed him outside, the morning sun warming my face as we settled onto the porch steps. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and for a moment the simplicity of it all felt grounding. I've been thinking about what you said last night, Ethan began, his voice low and thoughtful, about feeling stuck. I glanced at him, startled by his directness. I shouldn't have dumped all that on you. I was just in a weird headspace. I'm glad you did, he said, his tone firm. I care about you, Sophie, and I don't like seeing you so unhappy. His words hit me harder than I expected. I stared down at the mug in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. It's complicated, Ethan. Marriage isn't always what you expect it to be. Complicated doesn't mean you have to settle, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. You deserve more than this. I didn't respond, unsure of how to explain the tangled mess of emotions I was carrying. Ethan sighed, leaning back against the railing. Sorry, I didn't mean to push. I hate seeing you like this. His sincerity cut through my defenses, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Thank you, I said softly, for listening, for caring. He looked at me, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. For a moment I thought he might say something more, but instead, he simply nodded, covering my hand with his. The warmth of his touch lingered long after we retreated back into the house. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. Laundry, errands, a half-hearted attempt at cleaning the guest room. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. The way he looked at me, the gentle strength of his words. It was dangerous, this connection we were building, and yet I couldn't seem to resist it. That evening, as James and I sat across from each other at the dinner table, the distance between us felt more palpable than ever. He scrolled through his phone between bites, offering only the occasional comment about work or the latest news headline. I nodded along, barely listening, my mind elsewhere. Did you hear what I said? James asked suddenly, his tone sharper than usual. I blinked, startled. What? Sorry, I was distracted. He sighed, setting his phone down. I said we should consider going to that retreat next month, the one for couples. Oh, I said, caught off guard. Yeah, sure, we can talk about it. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might press the issue, but then he simply nodded, picking up his phone again. We'll figure it out. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing I should be more invested in the conversation, in our relationship. But the truth was, I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us anymore. Later that night, as the house settled into its usual silence, I found myself pacing the hallway outside Ethan's room. The light under his door was faint, a sign that he was still awake. My heart raced as I raised my hand to knock, hesitating for a moment before letting it fall. The door opened before I could change my mind. Ethan stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. Sophie? My voice faltered. I couldn't sleep. He stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. The room was warm, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. I sat on the edge of his bed, feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation. I feel like I'm losing myself, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I am anymore. Ethan sat beside me, his presence grounding. You're still you, Sophie. You just need to find your way back. The words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within me. I turned to him, my eyes searching his face for something I couldn't quite name. And what if I don't know how? You're stronger than you think, he said, his voice steady, and you're not alone. The air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken feelings. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was me, maybe it was him. But suddenly we were closer, our faces inches apart. His hand brushed against mine, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. "Sophie," he murmured, his voice filled with a mix of longing and restraint. But before either of us could take the next step, a sound from down the hall broke the spell. I pulled back, my heart racing. "I should go," I said quickly, standing. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Sophie." As I slipped out of the room and back into the darkness of the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. The morning after felt like walking through a fog. The weight of the previous night's almost encounter lingered heavily on my chest. I avoided Ethan at breakfast, keeping my answers short and my focus on the clock. James had already left for work, as always, before I was even out of bed. It was a relief not having to navigate both of their presences at once, one indifferent, the other far too attentive. I busied myself with chores, scrubbing countertops that were already clean and organizing the pantry by size and color. It was mindless work, but it kept my hands busy while my thoughts ran wild. The memory of Ethan's words, his touch, kept resurfacing no matter how hard I tried to suppress it. By mid-morning, the quiet of the house became unbearable. The sound of the door opening startled me, and I turned to see Ethan standing there, a hesitant smile on his face. "Hey," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied too quickly, forcing a smile. "Just cleaning." He walked closer, leaning against the edge of the counter. "You've been avoiding me." I shook my head, busying myself by rearranging the fruit bowl. "I've just been busy." "Sophie," he said, his voice low and insistent. "Last night, we should talk about it." "There's nothing to talk about," I said firmly, though my hands trembled as I picked up an apple and turned it over. "Nothing happened." "Nothing happened," he agreed, "but something almost did. And I don't think we can just pretend that didn't mean anything." I set the apple down and looked at him, my walls crumbling under the weight of his gaze. "Ethan, we can't—" "Why not?" he interrupted, his tone more urgent now. "Because it's wrong? Because it's messy? Or because you're scared?" His words struck a nerve, and I felt my resolve falter. "It doesn't matter why, it just can't happen." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You're not happy, Sophie. I see it every day, and I don't think it's wrong to want more than this." "Ethan, stop," I said, my voice cracking. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," he pleaded, stepping closer. "Tell me why you keep staying in a life that makes you miserable." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain the complex web of obligation, guilt, and fear that held me in place? Instead, I shook my head and turned away, retreating to the sink where I gripped the edge tightly. Ethan didn't press further. I heard him sigh, and then the soft sound of his footsteps retreating. When I finally turned around, he was gone. The hours crept by after that, the house feeling emptier than it had in weeks. I threw myself into cooking dinner, chopping vegetables with more force than necessary, and focusing intently on the sound of the knife hitting the cutting board. By the time James came home, the table was set, and I was stirring a pot of soup. "Smells good," he said absent-mindedly, dropping his briefcase by the door and loosening his tie. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile as I ladled soup into bowls. We ate in near silence, save for James's occasional comments about work. I nodded along, offering the appropriate responses, but barely hearing a word. My mind was elsewhere, on Ethan, on his words, on the feelings I was trying so hard to suppress. After dinner, James retreated to his office, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I cleaned the dishes slowly, each swipe of the sponge feeling like a countdown to something inevitable. It wasn't until later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, that I heard the faint sound of music coming from Ethan's room. Curious, and perhaps drawn by something I didn't want to admit, I found myself standing outside his door once again. I raised my hand to knock, but hesitated. My heart raced, the memory of our last conversation fresh in my mind, but before I could overthink it, the door opened, and there he was. "Sophie," he said, surprised but not unkind. He stepped back, gesturing for me to come in. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across the walls. Music played softly from his speaker, something calm and soothing that matched the warmth of the room. I began, then faltered. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry." "For what?" he asked, closing the door gently behind me. "For being a mess," I said with a weak laugh. "For dragging you into it." "You didn't drag me into anything," he said firmly, his gaze steady. "I chose to be here, Sophie, and I'm not going anywhere." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my defenses crumbling once again. "I don't know what I'm doing, Ethan. I feel like I'm spinning in circles." "Then stop spinning," he said softly, stepping closer. "Stop and let someone catch you." I looked up at him, my breath hitching as I realized just how close we were. His hand brushed against mine, a tentative, almost questioning touch, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. "I don't know if I can," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You can," he said, his voice steady and sure. "You don't have to do it alone." The air between us felt charged, every second stretching into eternity. His hand moved to my cheek, his touch light yet grounding. I closed my eyes, leaning into the warmth, and for a moment, the weight of the world disappeared. The warmth of Ethan's touch lingered on my cheek long after I pulled away. I had left his room quietly, my heart pounding in my chest as I tiptoed back to my own. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: guilt, fear, exhilaration. For the first time in years, I felt alive, but the cost of that feeling terrified me. The next morning, I avoided Ethan entirely. I busied myself with errands, leaving the house before he woke up and returning only when I was sure he'd gone out. I knew it was cowardly, but I needed space to think. What was I doing? What was I risking? That evening, James came home earlier than usual, throwing off my carefully constructed avoidance. He greeted me with his usual perfunctory kiss on the cheek, then sank into the couch with his laptop. I watched him from the kitchen, the glow of the screen reflecting off his face. He looked tired, worn down from work, but not once did he glance my way. "Dinner's ready," I called, setting plates on the table. He joined me a few moments later, his phone in hand as he scrolled through emails. "Looks good," he said, barely glancing at the food. I sat across from him, watching as he ate in silence. For years, I had told myself that this was enough, that his steady presence, his financial support, his reliability were what made a good marriage. But now, with Ethan's words echoing in my mind, I couldn't help but question everything. "James," I began hesitantly, "do you think we're happy?" He looked up, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean us. Do you think we're happy together?" He frowned, setting his fork down. "Sophie, where is this coming from?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've just been thinking a lot lately. About us, about what we want." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Of course we're happy. We have a good life, a stable life. Isn't that what matters?" Stable. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Stability was important, yes, but was it enough? Could I live the rest of my life like this, going through the motions, feeling invisible? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He returned to his meal, and the silence stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. Later that night, I found myself standing outside Ethan's room again. I told myself I was just going to check on him, to make sure he was okay after the tension of the past few days, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to feel seen again, to feel that spark of life he ignited in me. I knocked softly and he opened the door almost immediately. He must have been waiting. His expression was a mixture of relief and concern. "Sophie," he said quietly, "come in." I stepped inside, my pulse quickening as the door clicked shut behind me. The room was dimly lit, the same warm glow from the night before casting shadows across his face. He looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I don't know why I'm here," I said, my voice trembling. "Yes, you do," he replied, his voice steady but gentle. I hesitated, torn between the pull of his presence and the weight of my responsibilities. "Ethan, this is wrong." "Is it?" he asked, stepping closer. "Or is it wrong to keep pretending you're happy when you're not?" His words cut through me, exposing truths I had been too afraid to face. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I looked away, ashamed of the vulnerability I was showing. Ethan reached out, tilting my chin up so I was forced to meet his gaze. "You don't have to be afraid, Sophie. You're allowed to want more. You're allowed to be happy." The tears spilled over then, and before I could stop myself, I threw my arms around him, clinging to him like a lifeline. He held me tightly, his embrace warm and grounding. For the first time in years, I felt safe. "I don't know what to do," I whispered against his chest. "Then don't think about it right now," he said, his voice soothing. "Just let yourself feel." His lips brushed my forehead, a gesture so tender it broke something inside me. I pulled back slightly, looking up at him, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty. It all disappeared as I leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but it quickly deepened, fueled by years of unspoken longing and unmet needs. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as I let myself get lost in him. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, reality came crashing back. I stepped back, my hand covering my mouth as the weight of what we'd done settled over me. I have to go," I stammered, backing toward the door. "Sophie, wait," Ethan said, his voice pleading. But I couldn't stay. I needed air, space, time to think. I fled the room, my heart racing as I retreated to the sanctuary of my own. Closing the door behind me, I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The taste of his kiss lingered on my lips, a reminder of the line I had just crossed, a line I could never uncross. The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. I couldn't look Ethan in the eye without my heart racing and guilt clawing at my chest. He respected the space I clearly needed, though I could feel his gaze on me in those rare moments we crossed paths. His presence in the house had become both a comfort and a torment, a constant reminder of the boundary I had shattered. James remained oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. He went about his routine as if nothing had changed, his focus perpetually on his work and the detached sense of normalcy we had built. I envied his ignorance. It was easier than carrying the weight of everything I was trying to suppress. On the third night after it happened, I couldn't take the silence anymore. The house felt too big, too empty despite the people inside it. I left the kitchen mid-dishwashing, my hands trembling as I made my way to Ethan's room. Before I even had time to hesitate, I knocked. He opened the door almost immediately, his expression soft but cautious. "Sophie," he said, my name a mix of relief and worry on his lips. "Can we talk?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped aside, letting me in. The room was the same as always, small but warm, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. I sat on the edge of his bed, clasping my hands in my lap as he took the chair by the desk. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my words tumbling out before I could stop them. I don't know how to stop this feeling. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched me intently. Sophie, you don't have to have all the answers right now. But I feel like I do, I said, my voice cracking. I'm married, Ethan, to James. He's not perfect, but he doesn't deserve this. And what about you? Ethan countered, his tone calm but firm. What do you deserve, Sophie? I stared at him, unsure how to respond. His question echoed in my mind, unearthing feelings I'd buried for years. What did I deserve? To be happy, to feel alive? Or was I destined to stay in a marriage that felt more like a partnership of convenience than a true connection? And I don't know, I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. Ethan stood, crossing the room in 2 quick strides. He knelt in front of me, his hands gently resting on mine. Sophie, you deserve to be happy, to feel loved, seen, cared for, and if you're not getting that, you have to ask yourself why you're staying. His words hit me like a freight train. I felt the tears spill over, and Ethan wiped them away with his thumb, his touch tender and grounding. You're not alone in this, he said softly. Whatever you decide, I'm here. His closeness, his warmth was almost too much to bear. I wanted to collapse into him, to let him carry the weight of my emotions, but I couldn't. Not yet. I need time, I whispered, my voice trembling. I need to figure this out. He nodded, his gaze steady. Take all the time you need. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as James slept soundly beside me. His soft snores filled the room, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I turned onto my side, studying his profile in the dim light. There was a time when I had loved him deeply, when his presence alone could make me feel safe and whole. But that time felt like a distant memory now, eroded by years of distance and neglect. Ethan's words replayed in my mind, you deserve to be happy. The question lingered, unanswered. Did I? The days stretched into a week, and I threw myself into routines to distract myself. I cleaned every inch of the house, volunteered at a local shelter, and even suggested to James that we take a weekend trip. He agreed without much enthusiasm, though his willingness to try surprised me. Perhaps part of him sensed something was amiss. The night before our trip, I found myself standing on the back porch, the cool evening air brushing against my skin. The stars were scattered across the sky, their brilliance muted by the glow of the nearby streetlights. I heard the soft creak of the door behind me and turned to see Ethan stepping out. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice quiet. I shook my head. Just needed some air. He leaned against the railing beside me, his presence steady and comforting. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't tense, but it was heavy with everything we weren't saying. You're leaving tomorrow, he said after a while, his tone even. Just for the weekend, I replied. James thought it might be good for us to get away. Ethan nodded, but his jaw tightened. I hope it helps, he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of doubt. I turned to face him, the moonlight catching the concern in his eyes. Ethan, He shook his head, cutting me off gently. You don't have to say anything. Just be honest with yourself, Sophie. That's all I ask. The sincerity in his words, the unwavering support in his gaze was almost too much. I wanted to promise him something, to give him some assurance that I'd figure everything out, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move closer either. We stood there in silence, the night wrapping around us like a fragile truce. When I finally pulled my hand back and retreated inside, I knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, nothing would ever be the same. The weekend trip with James was meant to be a chance to reconnect, to mend the cracks in our marriage that I had become all too aware of. We drove in near silence, the occasional comment about the scenery or the weather doing little to bridge the emotional chasm between us. The countryside was beautiful, but it felt muted, as though my mind couldn't fully absorb it. James had booked a quaint cabin near a lake, surrounded by towering pine trees. The air smelled crisp, and the sound of water gently lapping at the shore was calming, yet my unease lingered. As we unpacked, I noticed James seemed more relaxed than usual, even smiling as he opened a bottle of wine for dinner. "This is nice, isn't it?" he said, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks. "It is," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's good to get away." We ate on the deck, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the lake. James talked about work, his plans for the next quarter, and a new project he was excited about. I listened, nodding in the right places, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan, his words, his touch, the way he'd looked at me with a depth I hadn't felt in years. As James poured us both another glass of wine, he leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice tinged with concern. I hesitated, the truth threatening to spill out, but how could I explain what was going on inside me? How could I tell him that while I loved the life we'd built on paper, I felt hollow living it? "I've just been tired," I said finally. "Work, the house, everything feels overwhelming." I thought of Ethan, his words, his presence, the way he'd made me feel, seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. The memory of his touch sent a shiver through me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. How had I let things get this far? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? The trip ended uneventfully, the drive home just as quiet as the journey there. James seemed satisfied, convinced the weekend had been a step in the right direction. I played along, nodding and agreeing when he suggested we make it a regular thing, but deep down, I knew nothing had changed. When we pulled into the driveway, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I didn't know how to face Ethan after the time away. Would he have moved on from our shared moments, or would he still be waiting, his feelings lingering like mine? As we unloaded the car, the front door opened and Ethan stepped out to greet us. He looked casual, his usual easy smile in place, but his eyes found mine almost instantly. Something passed between us, a flicker of unspoken understanding, and my chest tightened. "Hey," he said, his tone warm and friendly. "How was the trip?" "Good," James replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Much needed." Ethan's gaze shifted to me, and for a moment the world seemed to slow. "Glad you're back," he said softly. I managed a weak smile, my heart pounding as I hurried inside. The familiarity of the house felt strange, almost foreign, as if I had returned to a life I no longer recognized. That night, I couldn't avoid Ethan any longer. After James went to bed, I found myself standing outside Ethan's door once again. My hand hovered over the wood, trembling as I debated whether to knock. Before I could decide, the door opened. "Sophie," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and relief. "Come in." I stepped inside, my breath catching as the door closed behind me. The room felt smaller than usual, and the air thick with unspoken tension. Ethan watched me carefully, his expression both patient and hopeful. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I feel like I'm losing myself, Ethan, and I don't know how to stop it." "You're not losing yourself," he said, stepping closer. "You're finding yourself. It's scary, I know, but you're not alone in this." I looked up at him, my heart aching with the weight of everything I felt. "I don't know how to move forward, with James, with you, with everything." Ethan reached out, his hand brushing my cheek. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight, but whatever you decide, Sophie, I'll be here." His words, his touch were my undoing. I closed the distance between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and longing. This time there was no hesitation, no pulling away. It was raw, electric, and utterly consuming. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to be.